Sorry, no pressure.
Yeah, great. Is the recording started? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, great. So again, welcome to sort of the first Inspiring Populations conversation. So I think everyone should know me, but my name's Odhran Fox. I'm a PhD researcher based in Ulster University. And if anyone is particularly interested in any of the discussion points today, please feel free to contact, because I love chatting about this sort of subject area. So today's talk should take about 20 to 25 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. And, you know, we had sort of thought about this being more about sort of conversation, planning, maybe half-baked research. So it's always good to come and discuss things that maybe aren't fully complete, so we can get some guidance and advice maybe going forward and how we could improve our research. So I'll just be talking through some of the outcomes from my PhD work so far, and that's all about conceptualizing sort of the implications of post-Brexit decision making on international student mobilities. So maybe just to start with a bit of a background. So the wider PhD aims to examine this sort of interplay between geopolitics, governmental policy, and international student mobilities in the post-Brexit period. And we have a specific focus on sort of outward mobility flows of UK-domiciled students on a period of credit mobility. So this normally lasts between 1 to 2 semesters abroad. So this sort of project explores how international student mobility is constructed at multiple scales through the eyes of political decision makers at the governmental level, staff working to enable mobility at higher education institutions, and then finally the students themselves who are participating in these periods of study abroad away from their home institutions. So we're hoping that this project should develop a strong understanding surrounding the UK's new domestic Turing Scheme, argued to be this sort of successor to the highly successful Erasmus Plus scheme in the UK context. So this should help us to understand why the Turing Scheme was conceived in the first place, why the UK government elected to no longer participate in the long-running Erasmus Plus programme, and to investigate the rationales behind this and the impacts of these changes, you know, at the grassroots levels as well. So maybe just some background information as well. So Britain is identified as having a complex history of strained relations with the European Union. One academic actually argued that it's the home of Euroscepticism itself. So this sentiment has its basis in a rhetoric that constructs the European Union as a sort of hindrance to Britain's global destiny through supranational regulation and bureaucracy. And as a result, Brexit could be constructed as an opportunity for the UK to break away from this, an opportunity to reimagine the UK's identity, its sense of place in the world through renegotiating its relationships with Europe and beyond. So to understand its place within this sort of wider geopolitical sea change, it's important to recognise how higher education policy and approaches to international student mobility might become important during these periods of political reframing. So Brexit and universities could be viewed as being intrinsically linked because education policy can construct representations of what higher education is expected to be. Students' perceptions as well through constructing discourse that shapes the values, actions and positions taken by both the state, higher education institutions and the students themselves. So it plays an important part in reframing outlooks across the board. So for example, the neoliberal reforms were a period of wide policy reframing, and they also had a massive impact on UK higher education, which led to sort of the increased marketisation and the imperatives for internationalisation of higher ed that we see today as well. So as Brexit reflects on sort of Britain's place in the world, and universities educate its future generations, it's quite clear how education policy might modify provision to shape students' political ambitions and cultural ties as well. So international student mobility has been constructed in multiple ways. So it's accepted that international experiences are important to individuals sort of for personal development and the improvement of graduate employability as well. At a higher level, student mobilities in the form of exchanges are argued to help strengthen the state's soft power as well. And so this adds another layer to the relevance of student mobility policy while states are reconfiguring their geopolitical relations. And so for the individual, student study abroad presents a dynamic period of personality development and growth. So allows individuals to further develop their outlooks and perceptions of the world. And as such, Erasmus was identified as having this sort of key goal of fostering a pan-European identity and a strong sense of European citizenship. But despite this being a core priority of the scheme, a lot of work by Van Maal identified the sort of less significant impact of Erasmus at meeting this goal. He suggests that the period of study might not be sort of this core developer of the European outlook, and this was exemplified through a lot of regional and national variations. So there is this sort of suggestion that a lot of students that do become mobile have these sort of predilections anyway. And as such, I would argue that the purpose of Erasmus in this sense could be reconfigured to sort of support and strengthen the European identity through enabling or widening access to study abroad within Europe, which again would enhance these sort of outlooks in students that already to some degree have them, and then that is subject to the regional and national variation. But although this is debated, the fact that this sort of political or identity focus is a priority of the scheme is argued to have made Erasmus Plus a victim of a Eurosceptic enthusiasm for this sort of withdrawal from Erasmus, European institutions, especially one like this that attempts to enhance this sort of supranational sense of identity. Whereas in contrast, the Turing Scheme is argued to aid in this sort of wider global Britain agenda. This was a core sort of discourse at the time of the Brexit negotiations, and it pertained to encouraging global expansion, trade and mobility beyond sort of these confines of the European bloc. So Turing arguably acts to some degree as this sort of antithesis of Erasmus to sort of bolster a sense of either national pride or a global Britain. So with debate, I guess, surrounding both schemes' purposes and their ability to meet these goals, it's clear that there is a need to reflect on the construction of the schemes at governmental, institutional and individual scales to really conceptualise how these policies and funding changes might actually impact student mobility flows going forward. So what are we actually doing in the project? So we started the project by looking at governmental decision making through carrying out a critical discourse analysis of the Hansard database, looking at debates in the House of Commons and Lords to understand how the decision rather to withdraw from Erasmus Plus and develop the Turing Scheme was made, which helped inform as well some of the questions that we actually asked at later interview stages. Second, we held semi-structured interviews with key informants who primarily work within the higher education sector as global mobility staff, who sort of help encourage students to participate. And this was to explore the impact of all of these changes and how this sort of institutional level actually constructs student mobility, how they engage with policy, funding, contemporary changes, and then also deliver these to students and interact with students as well. And then finally, we interviewed mobile students to evaluate the impact of their mobility period on their development, their outlook, and sort of question the impact that the funding scheme might have on their wider study abroad experience as well. So together, these data should help us to create quite a strong sense of the impact of policy across the sector, right from decision makers to the individual, and provide insight into the scheme's success at meeting its own goals also. So as I said before, these sort of talks are all about sort of sharing early findings. So I just thought it'd be great to share some quotations that we've collected over the last number of months and sort of discuss those a little bit. So the rest of the talk is going to reflect on to the two key stages of data collection that we've done so far. So that's the Hansard analysis and interviews with higher education staff. So the Hansard analysis has been completed, and we ran this from the date of the Brexit referendum until the beginning of 2021. A more detailed discussion of this could be found in our recent publication in PSP, but just to sort of test the waters, I guess, as to how our project might develop, we're going to follow a similar thematic direction to that of the core findings from this analysis to explore some of the similarities and differences in evaluations and thought sort of across the scales. So we'll sort of present data that is going to reflect on uncertainty in the post-Brexit period, ideological decision making in global Britain, and evaluating the Turing Scheme itself at these two scales also. So we'll start with thinking about uncertainty. So these slides just have little quotes on them, so feel free to read parts of them, all of them, it's up to you. But debates surrounding Erasmus participation reflected on the impact of Brexit on students' aspirations, future opportunities, and planning if the UK chose not to participate as a third party. So this uncertainty prevailed long throughout the Brexit negotiations, with this actually still evident here in 2019. So at this point, there was still a strong sense of unrest and concern that the government was possibly failing to secure a good deal for students. And this is clearly expressed here by Diana Warwick. Publication by Owen and Durrant in 2019 evaluated the UK government's preparations for a no-deal Brexit. They noted the short timescale that was devoted to contingency planning, but they also cited priorities for this, such as legislating the EU Withdrawal Act itself, migration, citizenship, healthcare, customs and trade, and a number of other sort of key considerations. However, this report lacked any sort of mention of international student mobility in any context. So this does support this argument that student mobility and Erasmus Plus participation were quite low priorities for policymakers at the time, and rather an issue to be decided later on or even through the transition period itself. But one reason to sort of decide to end participation in Erasmus Plus focused again on uncertainties regarding the next iteration of the programme from 2021 to 2027 and the associated financial implications of ongoing membership. Nonetheless, John Bassam, a member of the House of Lords, noted here in January 2020 that this repeated lack of clarity created substantial issues both for students and institutions as they attempted to plan study abroad. So less than 12 months away, and they said like we still didn't know what was happening, so it was really hard to actually plan ahead to some degree. So overall, the years following the referendum were characterised by uncertainty and changing mileposts, largely, and this is really evident in the next quote, which I'll actually read because I think it's an amazing data. So last January, the Prime Minister told MPs that there was no threat to the Erasmus scheme. What a difference a year makes. So we found out in January 2021 that international student mobility would now receive funding through the domestic Turing Scheme. This introduction of the replacement was positioned by Clara Tyler here as the government somewhat redacting on its word, despite providing clarity that there will be funding of some description. So there's a clear sort of undercurrent of uncertainty that perpetuates right from the Brexit referendum until the signing of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So there's uncertainty has been a massive issue that has faced this sort of international student mobility sector in the last number of years. So it might be good to reflect on this theme in a little bit more detail and develop it further, taking sort of some of the data that we have collected through interviews with higher education staff and reflect on uncertainties faced at the institutional level. So from Alice here, we see the direct result of how uncertainty and changes to the enablement of student mobility was experienced at the institutional scale. So this quote identifies how institutions face massive structural changes to some degree following Brexit as a result of the total withdrawal of the Erasmus scheme. So in this case, both the withdrawal and the institution's own approach and strategy actually led to a total restructuring where some members of staff in the mobility sector actually lost their jobs as a result of this uncertainty. Again, here we see Esperanza identify the necessity that institutions place on external funding to enable their mobility. So there's quite a strong reliance on these sources of funding for students to be able to actually become mobile. So she notes this really high level of concern and uncertainty about what might have happened whenever the UK would withdraw from Erasmus. It was identified through debates and eventually came to fruition when we didn't continue with our engagement. So she actually identifies here through reading it that institutional experiences of Erasmus might actually have shaped their own constructions of what a good study abroad scheme or a good study abroad program might look like. She uses this term Erasmus Light, which she positions as this sort of institutional and governmental practice. So clearly there was a hope that a new scheme might mirror that of Erasmus if Erasmus members or participation was not possible. So it's clear that Erasmus is constructed in a very sort of successful light and is quite embedded within UK higher education. These institutions have quite a strong history with the scheme, and so their construction of study abroad actually appears to mirror that of the programme that they have most engaged with. So we see this sort of example here of how constructions of what study abroad is about seem to be passed down from the policy and the schemes that we're engaging with. And that actually shapes our own institutional outlooks on what study abroad is all about. Here, Julia refers to sort of the COVID extension. So if it wasn't for COVID and sort of money being able to be redeployed through Erasmus, it would have been less likely for UK institutions to have been able to continue with their projects for as long as they did. Some institutions were continuing their projects up until this summer. So this extension seems to have induced what Julia refers to as the long tail of Erasmus. This emphasizes its endurance and embeddedness and a preference for this in institutions within the sort of higher education landscape. It's something that was difficult to move away from and to totally sever ties with, especially that many institutions actually did have a preference for engaging with Erasmus over Turing if possible. Again, this sort of pays homage to the argument that Erasmus was more than just a funding mechanism. It was a scheme, a programme, a movement. So she notes how the enduring nature of Erasmus, coupled with this sort of broader Brexit discourse of severing ties with the European Union, did introduce some confusion whenever she did try to attempt to suggest that Erasmus was possible for students and staff in the post-Brexit period. So this anecdote does suggest this inference that Brexit insinuated from the get-go a total Erasmus withdrawal and a full severance from European institutions, despite this actually not being the case. And even now, we can see that we, with being able to re-enter Horizon and so on, we can see that we haven't just totally cut ties with all European institutions, but it does identify how wider Brexit discourses have been mainstay and increased some uncertainty or lack of clarity within the sector. So in this anecdote, Julia makes clear that this uncertainty that we had identified earlier throughout the Hansard analysis, the question of to withdraw from Erasmus or not, was not the only factor that has contributed to wider senses of uncertainty and confusion within the sector. This uncertainty is enduring as a result of the processes of the Turing Scheme itself. She emphasises how Turing has removed senses of financial or economic certainty for students that Erasmus was previously able to offer. So she argues that uncertainty surrounding the success of annual funding bids and the timeline of this process has led to greater uncertainties and complexities in the student decision-making processes, especially for students who might face more financial barriers to becoming mobile, who maybe are less likely to accept the possible financial risk of Turing funding not actually being available at the point of travel. So, and this is a direct result of institutions' Turing bids not really being received until the summer. So, student institutions don't know that they're actually getting the funding until quite close to students are actually going to begin traveling to their destination, applying for visas and so on. So here we see clear ramifications of how this might actually impact mobility participation going forward, especially without the sort of Erasmus Plus funds to fall back on. And again, even more enduring uncertainty. So Wendy argues that the end of this year is likely to be characterized by more complexity and uncertainty surrounding the continuation of the Turing programme itself. So this could be compared to that sort of initial concern about Erasmus participation, as Turing funding at the time was only initially guaranteed in the 2021 spending review with continuity for 3 years. So at the time of interview, this did remain quite unclear. So it's worth noting here that at the point of the initial Turing introduction, the Erasmus COVID extensions were still in place. So this did offer somewhat of a safety net for institutions to fall back on if their Turing bids maybe weren't initially successful. These are now over as of this summer. So concern in the HEI sector could be argued to be even more enhanced by this lack of safety net and uncertainty surrounding the future of mobility funding. So this theme of uncertainty clearly illustrates a lot of confusion and a lack of clarity faced at all scales for mobility stakeholders, government, institutions and students themselves. The uncertainty or unwillingness for government decision makers to prioritise a quick negotiation and agreement, the uncertainty for institutions to make their students aware of the funding that will definitely be available to them and how this impacts students themselves in their considerations of possibly being mobile, because if you're not sure if there's going to be funding, you're probably unlikely to actually even bother trying to apply if that's not going to be the case. So the next thing that we looked at was that of ideology and decision making. So James in 2021 argued that there was a superficial logic of ideology that was consistent with the drivers of the original pro-Brexit campaign, and this is what led to the introduction of the Turing Scheme. As early as 2017 here, the theme of ideological decision-making by the government was argued by Gillian Finlay. So unpacking this quote draws connections to this idea of a Brexit means Brexit mantra. This reiterated the legitimacy of the Brexit referendum and the necessity for severance from the EU institutions. So this opposition to a seemingly dominant political approach to negotiation is evident here, with pro-Brexit sentiment accused of overlooking these sort of wider issues to get Brexit done. This perhaps led to a failure to recognise sort of the multiple considerations of the negotiations, including that of the continuation of the Erasmus Plus programme going forward. This illustrates sort of how student mobility has become entwined with more complex geopolitics. And here, the utilitarian benefits of continued Erasmus participation to the individual seem to have been trumped by a geopolitical inclination which aims to sever the United Kingdom from the European Union just wherever possible. Again, through constructing students as future decision makers, it becomes important to consider how geopolitical predilections might be instilled during their formative years. So this link between academia and society makes it clear how governments might modify their education provision in time of geopolitical changes to shape the political or national outlooks of their citizens. So, for example, that would be, in this case, leading students and young people away from things that foster these senses of common European citizenry towards a more global citizenry. So David Davies argues here in January 2020 that the post-Brexit moment is illustrated as a pivotal point for the nation through comparison with the widespread neoliberal reforms of the 80s, which had significant impacts on higher education. This identifies a reframing of the British ideology, outlook, and aspiration to allow the United Kingdom to now enter the global arena, which is more in keeping with this sort of historic British identity and the global Britain rhetoric. This identifies a very strong sort of post-Brexit reframing in which many aspects of society are likely to engage with processes of change to meet these new sort of governmental goals or agendas. And finally, the first objective of Turing, which is outlined in this programme guide, which was in line with the UK government's wider vision at the time, is to encourage global Britain. This quotation further evidences this idea of an anti-European settlement and constructs the European Union as a bloc to British goals, identifying how maybe without these sort of confining boundaries or regulations, Britain might actually reach its global aspirations and achieve this new sense of a national identity. And Jacob Rees-Mogg posits the Turing Scheme as one key source of this. And exactly, it's sort of this idea of the Turing Scheme embodies what we're looking at, what the agenda is, rather than just funding mobilities for the sake of mobility. So to move back towards our interview data, Julia identifies how there seems to be an issue with trying to construct Turing as a brand or as an identity or movement in the same way that Erasmus could be constructed. She identifies that this lack of reciprocity would prevent the Turing Scheme from becoming a global movement or something of benefit to other states, and as such might not actually provide enough scope for Turing to have any form of this ideological impact. And this was also argued, by some members of Parliament and the scheme itself. To some degree, it would be seen more so as a funding scheme than anything else. And here we see another construction of the Turing Scheme, which would support that. So Wendy constructs the primary purpose of the Turing Scheme to be that of widening participation to international student mobility opportunities, rather than this sort of more geopolitical argument for ideology, which so far throughout our analysis appears to sort of trickle to these sort of institutional scales to a much lesser extent than this other sort of agenda of levelling up. So this sort of identifies how levelling up and widening participation is a strong institutional priority, regardless of other sort of more prioritized goals or agendas, which is quite interesting to note that maybe there is this sense of institutional identity and a focus for a student-centered focus that is at the institutional level that seems to be prioritized to some degree. And again, Thomas does see some possibility for global Britain to be brought about through the Turing Scheme. He identifies that in his work that Brexit has made it harder to sell Europe as a choice destination for mobile students, with visa processes of studying in Europe now brought in line with more global destinations for many students. This questions this sort of pull that European destinations previously had. This sees how post-Brexit mobilities are, qualitatively at least, being subjected to a modification as a result of the Erasmus funding, which was previously ascribed to Europe, and the freedom of movement as well, which would have encouraged students to select it as a convenient option. With these now removed, global mobilities might follow stronger sort of desirability pathways, whilst at the same time assisting this global Britain agenda and moving students beyond the EU. Julia supports this argument as well. She notes that this sort of funding that has now become ascribed to beyond Europe or all of the world allows students who are reliant on additional funding to access their sort of preferred destinations, which in her experience she notes are often those sort of English-speaking destinations beyond Europe. So clearly through this lens of ideology, it's clear how the UK's rollout and maybe the design of the Turing Scheme has lent itself to enhancing this possibility of a global Britain, whilst also modifying mobility flows away from Europe, which in turn arguably severs some European ties and might additionally encourage future partnerships and mobilities between the UK and rest of world. So the last few pieces of data I think would be important to share reflect on the Turing Scheme and how it was evaluated. So again, we'll start with parliamentary evaluations. So it's positioned as a replacement for Erasmus. It's marketed as better through its global scale and is aligned to this ideological goal of embedding the concept of global Britain. It was therefore positioned as offering students more choice in contrast to the limited geography of Erasmus. But this positive discourse surrounding the scheme has been debated as well, with the programme's development timeline questioned also. So it's been regarded as a last-minute plan. Alan Smith questioned the rush nature of Turing, and identifies that it is arguably a poor comparison to its predecessor, the Erasmus scheme, despite these sort of marketed benefits. The development of the Turing Scheme was also shrouded in these concerns, the speed at which it was conceived and whether it actually did enhance opportunities for UK students. It's important to reflect on this because the initial concern about this issue arose in 2016 and was resolved over 4 years later. So there is this extremely low prioritization of study abroad, with decisions made sort of in the 11th hour. But these long negotiations do identify sort of this sense of like a complex and differential sort of political approach between UK and European negotiators, which in the case of ISM seemed to be unable to reach a good compromise. So significant debate was given to the value and benefits of Turing, now the only option. So whilst also reflecting on its wider sort of implications and comparing it to Erasmus, largely. So Erasmus was argued by many as a scheme with wider benefits and scope despite its limited geography. So therefore framing the purpose of mobility schemes in more utilitarian terms would point to Erasmus Plus as having more favourable impact despite its more geopolitically unwelcome underpinnings for the UK. So again, we'll just sort of think about some of our quotes to finish from the interview data. So despite in the interview, I asked a question surrounding this idea of a political ideology and global Britain. Here, Alice instantly reflected on the Turing Scheme in a very positive light. She forgot about the more political undertones associated with the UK government's moving away from Europe to a much more global Britain. I think this reflects quite well this argument that higher education staff and the sector itself and their students are less interested in the political rationale behind the introduction of Turing, rather take a more utilitarian approach and are enthused by the sort of perceived benefits that the scheme might have with this sort of funding of more global destinations. So maybe there is a much greater individual cost benefit analysis going on than this sort of idea of a bigger political ideology. But despite this initial enthusiasm about the geographical scope of the scheme, she became more critical as to how the scheme was created and to what degree institutions were involved in the decision making. So I'll just read this one because it's quite interesting that this scheme was written by two people who have never studied abroad. I can guarantee it. Whoever wrote this scheme knew nothing about international mobility. So here we can see that the sector was not consulted to the degree that it would have liked to have been. And it wouldn't appear to be fit for purpose, the scheme itself. Again, Sarah talks us through the rollout and some of the key changes that happened throughout the Turing Scheme rollout since its inception. She told me how the original administrators of the scheme were the British Council, which operated quite well with some teething issues and technical problems. But it's important to note that there is this assumption that the first year of any new programme will be the hardest because of it being new, staff having to learn how to conduct processes and so on. But what is interesting is that Sarah believes that the second year was in fact more difficult as a result of the UK government outsourcing the running of the programme to Capita, which has made the process itself more complex and increased administrative labour in the sector. So Sarah identifies an increased workload, pressure, and a complex process. So it's interesting that maybe one of the key issues with Turing at this institutional level is the process itself rather than the goals or priorities of the scheme. So again, it's about how the programme is actually rolled out. And here from Julia, we see how Turing has had the impact of enabling shorter term mobilities through now offering the opportunity for institutions to offer funding, which is argued to help widen participation to international exposure. So again, we see how higher education institutions construct Turing in a positive sense and a perspective that appears to put the student opportunity and experience at the forefront. And here we see Wendy identify how despite this sort of total modification in both how study abroad is funded and the processes through which institutions operate and continue their partnership, she notes how the experience of study abroad for the individual itself remains unchanged, and in doing so would minimise this sort of broader purpose of Turing to that of a mere source of funding. So it could be Erasmus, it could be Turing, or it could be an institutional scholarship, but the actual experience for the student, Wendy argues, would be pretty much the same. And finally, Stephen strongly differentiated the Erasmus and Turing schemes. He argued that this government announcement of the scheme as a replacement for Erasmus is not the case. He identifies a really strong disconnect between policy and institutional evaluations. So this identifies the temporality of the announcement of the scheme, that it was last minute and occurred right before the scheme was thought to be due to be coming to a close. And it also supports arguments in Parliament that the scheme does not have a large enough scope to replace Erasmus and is likely going forward to need to either be expanded or be supplemented by other schemes that have similar utilitarian effects for the individual. And finally, he further emphasised this idea that the higher education sector in the UK does not have a strong enough sense of agency or enough power to modify or change the scheme or shape policy. And so the goals and arguments underpinning the scheme's operations are likely to unlikely rather to be impacted by the sector's lack of support for some of the other schematic attributes that they don't necessarily align with. So again, this is sort of a half-baked piece of work, but just to conclude with a short summary of some of the key points. So there were multiple considerations underpinning the UK's withdrawal from Erasmus Plus and its subsequent creation of the Turing Scheme. The post-Brexit period was and still is a zone of heightened uncertainty for the international student mobility sector, initially as a result of Brexit negotiations and decision-making, or lack thereof, and more contemporarily, the operations of the scheme itself. This early data makes clear how credit mobility in the UK context is likely to undergo observable shifts as a direct result of the Brexit process and subsequent political reframing and decision-making. And finally, international student mobility is constructed similarly and variably between the institutional and governmental scales, with this variation resulting from different priorities and strategies. So it'd be great if anyone has any sort of key points, anything they'd like to discuss, or any questions that I might be able to elaborate on.
That's great, Odhran. Thanks very much. Well done. Lots of interesting ideas and material. I think Rhys, you put your hand up first.
Yeah. Thanks, Guramagat. That was a great presentation. That was really interesting stuff there. Just pardon my ignorance. What's exactly the scale that this operates on? Because I'm not. This is where the kind of the complexities of devolution come in. I know the Welsh Government have a distinct tithe scheme, which is, again, it's different, but more along the lines of what Erasmus used to do. Is this, and I don't know what the situation is in Scotland and Northern Ireland, is this a kind of UK-wide thing, or is it just happening in England? And are there any kind of tensions have you identified between potentially different schemes operating, which potentially has the impact to confuse even further, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think you've really identified this level of complexity. Like, so the Turing Scheme is a UK-wide scheme that is available to offer funding for mobilities in all sort of 4 nations, but each, I guess, country or nation has the ability to implement its own scheme. So as you said, you know, there's the Thai scheme. There's also discussion about a Scottish scheme as well. And in Northern Ireland, there's been a lot of discussion around us actually being able to have access to the Erasmus scheme. So it is extremely complex, but we wanted to reflect on Turing because it's the only one that is actually a UK-wide scheme. And I guess the decision is made, the decision to withdraw from Erasmus was made sort of as a UK-wide decision. So I guess there are multiple, even governmental scales again. So it's a really interesting point. I don't know a lot about the Thai scheme, but it definitely is really interesting what I have read about it. Great. Kate?
Yeah, thanks, Oren. That's so interesting. There's so much going on there. And I think I've got a couple of questions or maybe points. One is really about the role of particular governments. So the government, I mean, as we know from the various inquiries into the current government behaviours during the pandemic and things like that, in some ways, ideology in this government is a proxy for some vested interests. So I'm quite interested in what's behind these ideological discourses and whether there's certain other agendas that are connected to maybe within higher education, within internationalization, you know, because internationalization is often is often tried to kind of be discussed in higher education as a kind of widening participation or diversifying strategy, but actually it's very different. The reality of why the internationalization agenda is so important, and I know that international student mobilities is different to that, but I'm just wondering like how all of these things link together in the decision making of governments and sector leaders to put support behind, and also actually from the interviewees that you found, because some of them were sort of quite critical of how the process has been managed around all of the different uncertainties and insecurities, but at the same time we're kind of on board with this global Britain narrative as if it was somehow diversifying experiences for students. But then again, you brought in the outsourcing of that mobility to a private company, and so there's all of these different processes happening, and I just wonder if you could reflect on that and if you've got any insight into some of the vested interests that might be behind it. That's a bit cynical, but
yeah, it's a really interesting point, Kate, and I find it so interesting. Like this idea of choice was a big sort of discourse throughout that. Oh, you can now choose to go anywhere, and it gives a lot of choice to students. But it's again like that is quite a dominant discourse when you look at sort of how the NHS is managed, and you know what the Conservative line is that idea of personal choice, and I guess that also comes down to neoliberalism as well, which is really interesting. And I think it will be great to sort of tie in a wider sort of discussion surrounding how the government itself has reflected or how it makes decisions across the board. Although so far our analysis only reflected on the mobility side of things, but it will be great to get a better understanding of maybe how other Brexit decisions were made in line with this sort of government agenda and global Britain, and maybe how global Britain is even perpetuated in other sectors, because a lot of interviewees have mentioned the existence of it in other sectors, but no one has really inferred how it happens. But again, it's so interesting, like reflecting on that, like this idea of like partnerships, and the fact is now, you know, there's no actual requirement from Turing to sign a particular partnership agreement. So you can sign a partnership with anyone you want, based on your sort of institutional strategy or priority. But it's actually meant that a lot of institutions are still signing partnership agreements. They're actually signing two. So they're also signing Erasmus partnership agreements, which are then reciprocal. And that's, well, not reciprocal, but, you know, it means that Erasmus students can't come in, because I guess all partnership agreements are reciprocal. But it's really interesting that despite this sort of reticence to participate in Erasmus, we're still seeing a lot of institutions signing these agreements, because for European institutions that are using Erasmus funding, that is a requirement and a precedent set by Erasmus, if that makes sense. So it's so complex, and it really does show, maybe, I guess, this idea of being drawn up at the last minute, that, you know, maybe the scheme wasn't as planned out strategically as it should have been, because we really should have maybe a uniform partnership agreement. And a few participants actually discussed this, saying that a couple of institutions did get together and draw up a uniform agreement that everyone could be signing, and everyone just seemed to have went back to their own, sort of to meet their own institutional goals. And it's interesting that there is this degree of freedom and heterogeneity in the sector as well, which, again, you know, as you said, everything sort of is complex and relates. So I guess that does come into this sort of perspective in the UK, that there is this desire for freedom, decision making, independence, so institutions can act and draw up their own agreements, if that makes sense. I know it doesn't really answer anything.
I think that'd be really interesting to kind of tease out a bit more, because you talked about like the educational in the sector being soft power of the state. And it's like, well, how is this particular scheme reflective of other priorities in the government, and how is it using the education sector to further its own vested interests?
Yeah.
I shouldn't be saying that, should I? Really?
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Sergey.
Yeah, very good presentation, very interesting, fantastic work. Your patience in terms of going through this database is amazing. You know, going through this quotes and collecting them. Oh, I can't believe that you actually did it. It's and you know, teasing out those little fragments. Really, you know, interesting stories. Really, big respect to you for doing this job, and kind of matching it up with the stories of people. Really good. I am thinking about, obviously, kind of fundamental questions here. I'm thinking about the 3 points which you identified to be important for your paper, which are uncertainty, ideology, and evaluation. I'm going to try to kind of ask questions about how you can perhaps place them in relation to the data which you explain. I'm thinking, how does it, you know, why is it, what makes it different in relation to the kind of stories which you told? And I'm thinking, first, it's obviously political change, and secondly, it's migration. So 2 things which are really kind of uncertain and developing, and never, and third, you know, political change and Brexit. You just said it. Brexit not over. It's not a sudden event. You know, it continues to be with us. It sort of continues to haunt us in different ways. And I'm thinking about how can you think about it in such terms as to tease out what exactly is kind of happening there. And I'm thinking that you might be comparing incomparable things in a sense. You know, they can be named in the same way, but I'm not necessarily mean the same thing. So you're comparing different schemes, but they're not necessarily about schemes, but about, like you said, desires or expectations or memories. You know, people reference things like the past, you know, the Thatcher, what Thatcher used to say, whatever it is, or, you know, or what would be the global Britain. Sort of, they're really kind of different animals. They're kind of framed as international mobility schemes, but they're not necessarily the same elements. And I'm thinking, I've written a paper about it in 2020, talking about this idea of impossibility of external evaluation. Kind of stand back and have a sort of a very clear reference system when you evaluate things, you know, and you know exactly how it translates. You know, the exchange rate of, I don't know, of 27 student mobilities versus 1 American mobility or whatever it is. You know, it just doesn't make any sense. Or personal experience. What is more important, as you know, gaining freedom, or I don't know, or independence from European, I don't know. It just doesn't quite work. And I'm thinking that this kind of calculative measurements and exchange logic doesn't quite apply to the schemes, because quite often they're based on this sort of thing, like desire. What did I say that? I was trying to tease out the words we're using. Aspirations, memories, sentiment, anxieties, kind of things about which are really difficult to measure and compartmentalize. And I was thinking you might want to have a look at what I did, and I'm not advertising my own paper, but it just kind of talks about the ways in which migration is very difficult to measure from that kind of one particular standpoint. And it's a kind of a lot about in between. You kind of develop it in the context of uncertainty, you know how it happens. And in that sense, it also changes the way in which you consider scale. So I'm wondering what the scale here is you're talking about geographical scale here, Europe versus global kind of thing. But I wonder whether it's a different sense of scale, in a sense of it's more like a distance, a kind of relational sense of it. We don't want to be part of this club. I don't want to be your friend. It is not necessarily about the fact that you live next door to me or not. It's just a statement like I don't want to see you ever again. And it's a very different sense of relation. And also it kind of links to the idea of people want to go to English-speaking countries. It's kind of that sense of which we don't want to learn foreign languages. We don't want to mix up with other cultures, kind of thing. Let's go to Canada and America because they speak the same language. And so there's lots of different things there which I really describe different kind of relation. And I wonder whether you want to look into that in the terms of scale, and scale not being scalar, but a much more kind of topological in a different sense. And the last thing I thought about was that kind of uncertainty. There's lots of stuff kind of there on uncertainty and about sort of relationship with the future. And I think you're really, your kind of your work is very closely related to this. What's going to happen? No one knows. How it's going to develop, still don't know. And that sense of uncertainty is there at every moment. What do you say? Like, 2 weeks before the start of the scheme, they don't know what's going to happen. A year before, nothing is certain. And I guess this kind of sense of uncertainty talks about this idea of the fact that that people, they kind of try to place something in a particular context. They try to map things. They try to make them kind of represented in a certain way. But within this kind of moving field of migration and political change, it's very difficult to have these markers. And I think there's a kind of different sense of ideology which kind of should exist, a different kind of thinking which can be sympathetic to understanding it. You're trying to map it in a logical, reasonable terms, while you're dealing with something which is very illogical, unpredictable. I don't know. So I wonder whether you want to think about a different way of expressing that uncertainty. Maybe, things like, affective openings or something like that, something along the literature of anticipation and emergency. This sense of emergency in Brexit, isn't it, right? 2 weeks to go, let's do it now, and get the Brexit done. Oh, I'm sorry. But there is a sense in which perhaps you can use a different thinking there to express it, which will be more sympathetic to the nature of the event which we're dealing with. But really interesting stuff, and makes me think a lot about what can be analyzed. But you're welcome to just discard it all, and just the paper looks great, honestly.
It's great, thank you, Sergey. Lots to think about. I've made a few little notes there. Yeah, definitely, it's this sort of idea, even when you're trying to compare, if in the interviews and in the Hansard data itself, even though they're talking about the exact same thing, it's a very different, there's a quite a strong disconnect a lot of the time. And I think, once everything has been pulled together, I think that's one thing that we are going to identify, is that you can't really compare these things the same way. You might also not be able to compare Erasmus and Turing like the government have done, because they're not on the same scope. They have, different priorities and everything like that. And then again, you also have, here it's very much Erasmus then Turing, but there's also lots of examples of institutional funding mechanisms too, which again are down a very different sort of line of priorities and strategies. And it's actually quite interesting that there was one institution I interviewed a few weeks ago, and they always had an institutional funding mechanism up until Turing was developed. And once Turing sort of had this wider scope, all of a sudden the funding was no longer there, which is quite interesting when you think about, well, you've got the precarity of the funding guarantee and so on, and instantly Turing appears to be a one-size-fits-all but it's also a successor to Erasmus. So there definitely are a lot of disconnects there. So really interesting. Thank you, Sergey.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm conscious of time. We've got the committee meeting in 1 minute or 2 minutes. That's fantastic work, and and thanks so much for volunteering to run the first session. I think we all enjoyed that. I think it's something we can take turns to do and invite other people to get involved with and stuff like that as well. So yeah, well done, great stuff.
Great, thank you for listening.
David, do you want to stop the recording so we can actually really say what we think about Odhran's presentation?
So we'll rendezvous maybe in a couple of minutes in another Teams meeting then, if that's okay. I was going to take a quick comfort break and I'll join the meeting in a second. Cheers. Well done, Oren. Cheers.
Thank you. See you shortly.